Good morning.
Good morning.
Today is October 1st, 2014. I'm here with Nancy Nolan Jones doing an interview for the Voicing in Action project of the Social Justice Institute of Case Western Reserve University. This is part of the community researcher interviews. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. And you?
I'm doing well. So, just in general, tell me about your experience with the Voicing in Action project.
I felt that it was a really exciting process. The training was exceptionally informative and helpful. I truly enjoyed meeting and talking to the people in the East Cleveland community, and I particularly enjoyed the camaraderie of the team members as we shared and moved forward in the process.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you came to the project?
I have been doing an oral history project in East Cleveland for the Snickerford's Community Time Capsule, and I have known Dr. Rhonda for some years now and asked her to be a part of that project, and she graciously agreed. And then when this project came up, I asked if I could be a part of her project, and she said yes. I wanted the training, and she says yes, as long as you do the interviews. Well, of course, you know, doing the interviews is my passion, so that was not a problem at all. So that's kind of how it all got started. So we did I can't remember how many interviews we did for the Snickerford's Community Time Capsule, but we turned them all over to your Voicing in Action program to have in your archives as well. So I feel that there was a real strong connection between my project and your project, and I was very happy to participate.
And do you live in East Cleveland?
I do not.
Okay. How did you first become involved in East Cleveland?
I worked at Ed Parker's. It's called the EEP Arts Gallery, EEP Arts Complex, I guess. And he is a longstanding member of East Cleveland, and he has quite a few pieces of property clustered together on Roslyn off of Euclid. And I worked for him. And I wanted to see how I could assist him in growing his company, and looked at oral histories as one significant artistic way that he could maybe assist the city's growth and take a look at itself and see, because there was change happening all around in East Cleveland, and I felt that somebody needed to document that change. And so we proceeded with the Snickerford's Community Time Capsule. We got University Circle involved, and, you know, of course, Dr. Rhonda and Mark Chupp from Case Western Reserve and a couple of other people from the Case campus participated in our project. So it was really the eye-opener to look at the changes and things happening in East Cleveland. So this was a natural follow-up of that process to take an even closer look at it and talking to even more people. So that's how I got here.
How has your perception of the community changed due to your involvement with the project?
How has my perception of the community changed? I see that there's a lot of people here that really care about their city, that have been here for years, and I see that this project helped to stimulate their awareness of what was going on in their city, and to emphasize that people were interested in knowing what's happening in their city And I think that this particular project was a catalyst, or helped to be a catalyst for that, to let them know that they lived in a beautiful community, a changing community, and that they had a voice into speaking about how they viewed their community and what they wanted to see improved in their community.
And so the Voicing in Action project was different than the Snickerfritz project because we asked questions that were more geared towards talking about race and racism and other forms of inequality. Did that change your perception at all of the city?
I would have to say no.
Okay.
No. And the reason I would say that is because as an African American, I viewed the city through those lenses, and there were observations in this particular city and in life in general. There were parallels, so no, it didn't.
So what skills have you learned?
I learned to be more succinct in my ability to ask questions. I believe that I learned a different approach to interviewing. Learned a little bit about the camera. I think I learned to listen even more closely, which significantly helps with the follow-up questions and to see to engage the people to share more. So, yeah, I think the approach, the interview approach, was the major learning process for me. In my interviews prior to that, it was a little bit more of a general approach. This was very targeted, more specific, and you had to really know how to pull that out of them and ask it in different ways that it didn't always require a straightforward approach. I mean, it didn't always work. So you had to learn how to ask that question in different ways and to be able to extract it from maybe a different point of view, and you would help them to see that they were indeed answering that question, but maybe in their own way. So that was really a tricky piece for me, and I really believe that I've grown as a result of that.
And what about your analytical skills? Do you feel like those have changed?
Not so much. I'm a very analytical person by nature, so I think that I don't think change maybe is heightened, if anything, because of the pointed questions that we were asking. Made me think about things even in more depth, if that was possible. Because remember, I said I came into this process when I started the Snickerfritz because I saw change happening in the community. So I was already pretty much aware of that in analyzing that whole process. This project helped me to zero in on it a lot more.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm specifically thinking about our monthly meetings. Did you find those helpful to kind of think about the different ways that change was happening? I don't remember how many of those you went to before.
Yeah, I went
you
to.
stepped back.
Yeah, I did go to quite a few of them,
Okay.
and I felt the dialogue was. I thought the dialogue was really very helpful for myself and for others. I believe that because I was already on that page, so to speak, I was already looking at the change. I'd already been to Form with Mark Chubb and saw the work that he and his students had done. And they had charts all around the room talking about changes that were imminent and things that were going on in the city. So, you know, when I came into the process, I had already been queued up to really pay attention to some of those changes. So I don't think this process changed any of that, but it made me look at the impact of those changes on the people as in a more intimate way as we continue to interview. Because in the Snickerfritz project, we basically asked them to share their memories of East Cleveland. Now, in the Voicing in Action project, we were asking for specific ways that they experienced racial inequality and different changes that were happening in the city. So I think it fine-tuned it, you know. I don't think that it changed anything for me. I just think that it fine-tuned it and it, you know, just kind of intensified the look and allowed me to see it from the perspective of the different people that lived here. It was very interesting.
And do you feel like at the monthly meetings you were able to share your insight?
I do. I felt like I was able to share my insight. I was trying to be careful about overshadowing everybody else, giving them a chance. Since I kind of had a head start in it, I wanted to be really careful about holding my opinion and not being so vocal to allow other people. I don't think that I really achieved that all the time, though. I think that I got to be kind of known as the big mouth. But, you know, I felt that I always feel that communication is really important. And I think that the more people communicate and share their ideas and views, the greater clarity people will have about whatever they're involved in. So there were times when, because I worked in East Cleveland, you know, I can remember bringing Miss Mack to another meeting that was happening in the city that we learned about as a result of being in this project, and that increased her awareness, and then she was able to spread the news. So I felt like a resource person in a great way to not only Miss Mack, but a few of the other people, because I worked in East Cleveland, so I encountered people every day. And so I was able to share and direct people to different forums that the mayor was holding. You know, I was very involved with working with the mayor and his committee to bring another project into the city. It was a construction project. So I was really tied into the city in a number of ways. So this Voicing in Action project was, I think it was an excellent opportunity for me to be in a less formal capacity to really hear what the residents were thinking and helping them to express it. And I really appreciated that about this project. So you can't always do that in community forums. You know, people are talking and over-talking one another, and they're just kind of in the information gathering process. So, you know, when they have time to really reflect on what they've been introduced to and to give that back out, which they did in an interview, I think it's an invaluable opportunity for both the person who's doing the sharing and the ones who are learning from what they have to share.
That's a good way to put it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, how would you prepare for an interview?
I can't. I think the preparation came in terms of who I selected for my interviews, the interviewees, just trying to get a broad perspective. So the preparation really came in selecting people from different backgrounds that could give different perspectives of the city. And, it would require that you had several conversations with them to just get a little understanding, a better understanding of, what their perspectives were and how that might be a valuable contribution to this project. So I think it would, loosely, it was kind of like a pre-interview and really just in the interview selection process. And then, of course, there was always the logistical pieces that you had to work out with your camera person and, the timing and all of that, the location and all of those things were, very time consuming to get all of that flushed out. So when you actually got to the interview, that was definitely the reward for all the hard work.
I'm definitely having that experience myself.
Are you?
I'm interviewing all the community researchers, and I've already had 2 cancellations and one, like, we moved yours.
Yeah.
And I was like, I remember this.
Yeah.
I feel for them.
Yeah. And the fact that you're doing the camera helps to lessen that a little bit. But when you have to coordinate the camera person's schedule and the interviewer's schedule and the interviewee's schedule, that's a lot of consideration that has to be worked out. So, this process is not to be looked at lightly, just in the preparation of getting the interview scheduled. And mostly the hardest part is talking to that person and making them feel at ease, to make them understand that they have a valuable contribution in what they have to say, and that people really do want to hear from them, and that it's going to be painless, and that we really will honor and take care of what they have to say and not pull it out of context, and treat it with great respect. That is really the critical piece that I found that you had to make sure was completely addressed and fleshed out with the interviewee. So the scheduling was an issue in and of itself. Selecting the person through referrals, just taking a look at who they were, in terms of what they did, how long they lived in the city, and if they would be a good candidate. And then having that conversation with them, and it wasn't always easy to just dial them up and get that conversation. You had to sometimes go through somebody to get to them, and then when you got to them, you had to kind of make them feel at ease. And so it wasn't some went more smoothly than others, but it definitely was a process.
So do you feel like it would have been easier if you had had more confidence in using the camera by yourself? Why did you choose to work with a partner is probably a better question.
I don't multitask that well, and my prior experience was having a camera person to manage all of that. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to not have to be concerned with that aspect of it. I wanted to really be able to give my full attention to the interview process. Maybe if I was a little younger, maybe I could have managed all of those things, but, you know.
And did you use the biographical sketch sheet?
I did. And most of the people that I interviewed resisted filling that out. They did not want to fill that out. But the irony of it is they answered all those questions in the interview anyway. So I knew that the information would still be obtained, even if they didn't specifically write it down. So, you know, as we guided them through the interview, I would make sure that all those points were covered. Try to, anyway.
Do you feel like people would have been more open to filling it out after the interview?
No.
No.
Mm-mm.
Because from a social science perspective, like I don't know if you, like on surveys and stuff, they don't ask you your demographic information until the very end after you've talked about everything else. So I was wondering if that would have maybe helped us get, because we didn't really get a good response on the biographical sheet.
Mm-hmm. I think African Americans like to talk. I think we like to talk, but I think we're suspect of governmental forms and such. So to write it down was not something that people were willing to do. But because we're verbal people, we share the information anyway. But we can't see the correlation that, you know, we're sharing it anyway and writing it down. But no, they didn't want to do that at all. Okay. And at the end, they were very happy for the interview. But typically at the end, they were done. They wanted to move on and do whatever else was next on their personal agenda. And I did try. I think I did try once to see if they would do it at the end, and they said they would get back to me, and they never did. I think, and if I recall right, one person was like that, but the rest just refused. No.
Okay. And did you find that people would do that thing where they would be very guarded on camera, and then you would turn the camera off?
Yeah.
Did you find any good solutions for dealing with that?
No. Well, yes and no. One interview in particular, when we turned the camera off, we did a lot of stroking and a lot of reassuring that the information would be used in the most respectful way and educational purposes, et cetera, and that they would have a chance to, if they didn't approve of what was being said, they could, you know, have it deleted. But it was really important for us to have the full story. And when we would turn the camera back on, they would give a modified, that person gave a modified answer, not the full-blown answer. So I think it has to do with I think it has to do with maybe feeling a little bit of a sense of a big brother watching you concept, and also a little bit with upbringing in terms of speaking ill of somebody. And then I think it had to do with knowing that things can come back to bite you no matter what, no matter how you put it. And so, you know, regardless of what the purpose of this information was, I think that people were mature enough to know that they had to temper some of the things that they were saying and the way they were saying them. There's, your parents will say it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And you might have a personal opinion about someone, but you don't always just speak that out loud because it could be detrimental to you and to the other person. So when they asked to turn the camera off, they would share their innermost feelings about something, but they weren't going to go on camera to share that with the world and to see how it might be misinterpreted, and they would not be there to clean it up, so to speak. So, yeah, we definitely experienced that. So we the only thing that could really make that less of a issue was to reassure them and to just kind of talk to them. And then that would give them a chance to really rethink of how they might want to say it, and hopefully say it in a way that made them feel comfortable, that they wouldn't mind. Because once you make a statement, it's out there. You can't pull it back, and So they had to really think about that. But it really made them think. The interviews took them back and took them places and helped them to remember things that, you don't call up in your everyday thoughts and actions. So the interviews really took them back to a very methodical, it was a very methodical process that would take them back to really review certain situations that had happened in their lives. So I think it was really good in that respect, that it helped people to really have a life review, and have a life review in the context of this city, living in this city rather.
So how does the setting of the interview impact the work?
Oh, you have to make people feel comfortable. If you're not comfortable, you're not going to talk. And excuse me, the person doing the interview, there has to be good chemistry. They have to feel comfortable with you. They want to make sure that people always want to be understood, and if their setting isn't a place where they feel comfortable to start, then the conversation can't even really begin. So I think that's the critical piece, a place where they feel comfortable. And a lot of times people feel very comfortable in their own setting as opposed to going to an office or someplace else. So when you interview them in their own setting, that's already relaxed, not maybe removed, but it has relaxed a barrier to that communication.
Do you feel comfortable here?
I do.
Okay. And kind of on a more logistical point, did you find any challenges dealing with, if you were going to all these different settings, were there any logistical challenges?
Lighting. So, in my other collection, my videographer always had lights with him. So, that might be something in the future going forward that you might consider.
What kind of lights? Because we have like a little stand lamp.
Yeah.
Was it like professional lighting?
It just depends. A lot of times he had a 3 bulbs across, and it would be on a stand. So, and I don't know what bulbs those were, what wattage, because that was the technical side that he handled. But, you know, it would really light up the area and get rid of the shadows. He was very, you know, very meticulous about that, because you can't, you know, we're approaching it from not from a real videographer's perspective. We've learned the camera and we've learned a lot about the lighting, and we could see in the camera, you know, my partner was just a lot more fastidious about the lighting. But I think that a spotlight, and I don't know how it would shine. We'd have to have training on that to see how the best angles and where to put the light behind the person. I know you can't shoot into the light if it comes off the side, or just how to do that.
Mm. I know that was a constant struggle for
I think
everyone.
I think really what you want to do is just illuminate the area, you know, so however best you can make that happen. And sometimes you might have to have a light with you because everybody's house, you know, doesn't have all of that.
Did you ever feel uncomfortable going to someone's house?
No.
I know one interview in particular you did at a funeral home. Was that different?
No. That was just, no, not at all. He was, the main thing is that he felt comfortable. It really wasn't a question about whether I felt comfortable as, you know, as the interviewee. It wasn't my comfort that was the primary consideration for me. I wanted to make sure that the person that we were interviewing was comfortable, and then we adapted to wherever we were.
What has been the most surprising and or challenging aspect of the work?
The most surprising? I don't know. I can't say that there was anything that was so surprising. I'll have to think about that. The challenging piece would always have been making people feel comfortable enough to open up. Some did it more readily than others. Just trying to make them dig deep for those answers. It was challenging for me to ask the questions in different ways, and to keep the interview moving and not make them feel like they were being interrogated. That was the most challenging aspect for me. Some of the questions, the scripted questions, were, to me, they were similar in a way, and then you had to add additional questions if they weren't answering those. You had to ask them in different ways, and they were already, a couple of them were very similar in terms of feeling discriminated against. That was, I guess that was the biggest one for me, and helping people to see without really spelling it out for them, you know, asking the open-ended questions to make them think, and not have it be interrogation, but just be a flow of conversation. For me, that was the learned part of interviewing for me, and that was the most challenging piece for me.
Well, do you feel like, are you talking about the racism question followed by the inequality question?
Yes.
How would you reword that? Because I think that because East Cleveland is a predominantly African American community and a lot of people confront race and racism in their everyday lives, how would you change the follow-up question to ask them if there was any other way that they felt that they had been treated unequally? Like, without being like, I see you're a woman. Do you ever feel like people have discriminated against you because you're a woman? Or I see that you've told me that you have a different sexual orientation. Like, does that impact? Like, how would you change those questions? Because that was the goal of it, was not to just talk about racism, although that was probably foremost in everyone's mind, but also think about different ways. Do you have any suggestions on how to reword that?
Not off the top of my head, and it's been a while since I've stepped back from it, so I have to really kind of rethink that. But usually I found that when people shared their experiences, the answer came out. I think if you ask a person to describe, if you knew they were raised in a certain community in a certain period of time, describe what that was like going to school for you, then you would get those answers without even having to ask them. And I understood that you wanted to be specific about asking that question so you could grade it with a specific answer. But usually I found that it was embedded in a person's experience. And once you ask them to describe their experiences, those questions would come out automatically. Those questions would be answered. So I think instead of putting the responsibility on us as the interviewers to try to get those answers in a specific way so that they could be graded on a survey in a specific way, I think that that more responsibility should have been put on the person who was reviewing them to see if they could hear the same things we were hearing. Like, yes, this person talked about going to school and not having whatever, or going to court and not being, so yeah, they did feel inequality, but they may not have, the person themselves may not have defined it that way. So at this stage of the game, try to make them define it that way was not always easy. And I think in general, as I've grown up as an African American, I've seen discrimination, but I've also, as I've grown, I've learned that it didn't only exist in my community. I've seen how it has reared its ugly head in other communities and how other people have felt that. So, we could have maybe had discussions around that in our researchers' sessions about that, because we were African Americans interviewing African Americans, and it was just, from my perspective, it was like, of course we've experienced it. Of course it was all over the news. Who doesn't know this? Of course we've been turned down in situations. Of course we may have encountered certain situations. And then sometimes you might have, I'm kind of thinking about my own life experience too, in terms of answering this question for you, because I didn't feel discrimination growing up. even though I was an African American, I didn't feel discrimination. But if I described a certain situation that I encountered, it might have been in my mind, in my naive mind, an encounter. And I would not have known to classify it as, oh, this is discrimination, and let me address it as such. I don't think that we automatically connect those dots. We're just living life and experiencing what we're experiencing and not putting it in the context of the larger societal frames. So I don't know the answer to your question. That's the long. I don't know. You know, we had to. That was most challenging for me, how to ask those questions and pull it out of them. And I was hearing it in their answers, but making them connect the dots to say, yes, this was racial discrimination, and you know, inequality. You could feel that within your own race, the inequality, and sometimes you could feel racial discrimination within, you know, but you don't really define it as such. You define it as an encounter in life.
Well, I think that
labels, when you label things.
But at the same time, like, because I'm doing a lot of the analysis and Dr. Rhonda's doing a lot of the analysis, but especially for me as a white woman, not from Ohio or East Cleveland, what you heard and what you might be able to say, oh, well, that was an instance of racism that they're not necessarily classifying as racism. I don't feel like I could look at that same video and be like, yes, that was racism. Because if they define it as just an encounter and they don't think that it was an experience of racism, then far be it from me to be like, no, you're wrong. I'm going to tell you how you feel.
Yeah.
So I think that the point of those two questions was also to ask people to kind of dig deep and think about their experiences. And I felt like you did a really good job of drawing people out, and when they would talk about those things, asking them in more detail, but you were very subtle. And I think that works when it's in dialogue, but in knowing that people are going to see this in the archive and they're going to have a bunch of different perspectives, I think something more overt. I think that you had an incredibly light touch, and you would get people to open up about things that they may not have opened up about. But I think the goal of the voicing and empowering voices was to get people to name what it was they named. And if they didn't want to define it as inequality, then we shouldn't define it as inequality.
Right. I could see that.
So
a lot of it may have to do with who I am, too. Mm-hmm. And not wanting to ask those hard questions. Not wanting to make people feel like I was interrogating them. And maybe it really wasn't, because they went into the interview knowing that they were going to be asked these questions. So in some ways, I know that there's two schools of thought, but in some ways they may have been able to look at these questions in advance to really give it some thought.
Mm-hmm. Did it get easier to ask those questions?
Yes. And it wasn't hard to just say, have you experienced inequality? That wasn't the hard piece. The hard piece was hearing their story and drawing it out, making them name it. That was hard. Mm-hmm. And so that probably maybe the difficult piece was on me. And I do get your point that even if they share the story and they don't define it as inequality, you being the behind the scenes person, how could you label something that they didn't label? So I do get that too. So thank you for this dialogue. But it is that was the challenging piece for me. And so maybe if we had given them those questions in advance, they might have thought about it. They might have talked about it with their family and then come up with something to share. You know, like right now I'm groping for the right words and thoughts and everything. And sometimes you have to think things through more deeply and you know, and then come up with it. And sometimes people are just as naive as I am. I was very sheltered growing up. I was very sheltered and had no clue about the things that were going on around me. And I graduated from high school in 1966 in the height of the civil rights movement. But the civil rights movement didn't hit Cleveland like it hit Alabama. And if you weren't from an activist kind of family, then those things weren't discussed at your dinner table like they may have been discussed at another person's dinner table. So I think it really just depends upon who the person is, and the context of their upbringing would say, in Cleveland, as I'm doing interviews outside of this Voicing in Action project, I've learned that Brown versus Board of Education happened in the South. It didn't happen in Cleveland. Our segregation came about in a different way. I personally went to school with all nationalities of people. And so I didn't have a situation where I was refused to be able to attend a certain school. My mother didn't have to march, and we didn't really talk about that in my home. So that wasn't in my reality. So I really wouldn't be able to say certain things. And so then when the segregation piece came to Cleveland was when white flight took place and people were moving out, and then the neighborhoods became segregated, and then the school boards tried to do the integration piece. So ours looked a lot different than somebody else's. But somebody like me, I had no clue that these things were going on. I had no clue that these were issues. And I was a little disappointed and maybe a little upset that my family didn't really talk about those issues. So when I had my children, I was a lot more verbal with my children about these issues. I was plugged in then. So, saying all that to say that we could be dealing with people that are just living their lives and haven't a clue that those are the parameters, those are the things that possibly could or have impacted them. In 1969, I was hired at Northwest Airlines. I had no clue that I was part of affirmative action. My friend said, come get a job. My mother was bugging me about getting a job. I went to work and applied for a job at Northwest Airlines. It didn't even dawn on me that there were maybe only like 5 blacks there and all these white folks that I worked with. It wasn't so unusual for me that I would say, oh my gosh, I'm affirmative action. I'm a trailblazer. Oh, I'm here. And now I had wonderful encounters with all the people that I work with, white and black. And it wasn't till years later when I look back on that situation that it could have been, or that it was actually what it was. So maybe if I had the questions that you were giving, I would have been able to discuss that and really think about it and apply it to, yes, I can give you these examples because in retrospect, this is what happened in my life. But when it was going on, I wasn't really thinking about that. I was in a whole nother place.
I mean, are any of us really thinking when we're 20, 21? I mean, I did all sorts of things that, looking back, I'm like, oh,
It didn't dawn on me.
Yeah.
It didn't dawn on me. My mother would not allow me to go to Ohio University. I had to go to where my mother's best friend, who I called Aunt Joe, went to Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina. Had no clue that they had just had a lunch counter sit in. Had no clue. So I, in my adult life, felt like what an injustice that was on my mother's part to send me in that part of the country so green and so naive. And then again, maybe she thought I knew. I don't know. But that's my personal story. And so maybe knowing and looking at life through my lens and knowing that I had not really assigned those labels to certain situations, maybe that carried over in my interview process, in my thinking that they may not have assigned those same labels to their situation, but let me hear your story because I know that through your story, like through my story, we will hear about some of these things that we're talking about.
I think that's an important perspective to remember also, is that you're coming to this with your own history. That,
Yeah.
the joy of working with community researchers and working with people from different backgrounds coming together on a project like this is having everyone approach it from such different life ways. And I'll be honest, when I started, it was frustrating for me because people weren't asking the questions that I would ask. And it took me a minute to be like, that's part of the richness of this, is that everyone's getting all these different questions. And so not only are we learning about the people that you're interviewing, but we're learning about you as well.
Right, because everybody's coming from a different perspective. And they're coming from a totally different place. I grew up in, right now, I live in Shaker Heights. We moved into Shaker when I was 16 years old. And I didn't want to go to Shaker Heights High School. So I walked around the corner and caught the bus to John Adams, where I finished. John Adams was an integrated school at that time, so I didn't know segregation. But I also didn't know Shaker Heights schools. Now, did I have friends at Shaker Heights schools? Yeah, I didn't even think about it. The part that probably impressed me most was they had the finals, and they were so intensely challenging, but I had a lot of friends at John Adams, and I wanted to stay at my school. At that time, Shaker was really still being integrated. And the fact that we moved next door to the assistant superintendent, he didn't care that I wasn't coming in the district illegally. He didn't care that I was going around the corner to go, their guard was to keep people from coming in. So, my experiences have been a little bit different than an East Cleveland experience because, I feel like in a lot of ways I was in La La Land as a child and growing up. I didn't wake up until later. So then looking at me as an interviewer, then I guess maybe I was a little soft in asking those questions, and maybe it was because of my own personal experiences. They weren't such indelible experiences in my life. And when I grew up and I heard that, Martin Luther King had been here, Malcolm X had been here, I was like, what? How come my mother and my parents and grandparents, my father passed when I was 4, we didn't talk about this in the house? And my father passed when I was 4, but my father's job was working with the Bureau of Employment Services, and he would go to different companies to help pave the way to get African Americans into jobs. And John O'Holly is a very famous person in the Cleveland area who was much more of a radical in a sense of developing the Future Outlook League to get integration. He was the one that would lead people to pay their phone bill in pennies, or lead trucks of people to go jump in the community pools to integrate them. Well, John O'Holly and my father were friends, and they did a lot of things together. And my father grew up in Iowa, and the white businessmen of Iowa sent my father to the University of Iowa. He graduated from college at the University of Iowa. So my experience has been very different, but maybe if my father had lived longer than, when I was 4, I might have learned some of these things that were going on. My mother wanted to make sure that I didn't have a father. She wanted to make sure I had as normal of life as possible. So she did the best she could. She sheltered me from a lot of these things. But now, as I've grown up, I put these pieces together, and that's the context that I come to this whole process with. So I love history now. I love hearing about people's stories, and I'm able to see it, but I don't press them, I guess, because I wasn't pressed in the in the growing up situation. I just didn't have those kind of racial encounters. I had a lot of white friends at Adams. Adams was a very integrated school, and I lived in a very integrated community that's still integrated. So a racial equality could have been walking in the store and encountering somebody that was having a bad day and was rude. Maybe not racial, but just a bad person, just a rude person. So I don't know. I think we're getting off the track, and I'm giving you my life history. But I do it. I offer that in terms of just trying to think through and talk through what my role as an interviewer had been and how maybe I could have improved that. And I will say that this conversation that you and I are having is very insightful, and maybe we should have had that conversation when we were building our team, and then that way these things that I'm sharing with you now could have been illuminated, and it could have impacted the way we went about asking those questions. And it could have, also helped some of my other teammates to really think about how they were asking the questions in the context of where their own personal experiences have come from.
I think that's a great suggestion. So I'll say this a couple times because I don't know that it's really clear. How did what you actually do differ from what you thought you would be doing?
It didn't.
Okay. So you feel like after the training, you were adequately prepared to go out and everything kind of went the way you expected it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Excellent job.
Would you encourage others to participate? And if so, what advice do you have for future community researchers?
Well, prior to our conversation today, I might not have had that answer, but given that we've just had this lengthy discussion, it's obvious that I would say to consider going into this kind of a project, to consider your own background, and I would say that it would be helpful if you had those kind of dialogue sessions with the community researchers so that they could see who they were in the process. Mm-hmm. I think if you're clear about who you are, it will help you to it will help you in your delivery of the questions a little bit better. And, getting the feedback from you said I was very subtle and I was very soft about it. So had I heard that early on and we had this conversation, maybe then that's where I could have made my personal adjustment. Because clearly we have to make the adjustment in order to get what we want from the person. So we've got to see who we are in the process. So this has been really good. Thank you.
I'm glad. Well, what about the kind of time people can expect to commit to the project? I feel like I wasn't here for the training, but I feel like there might have been some underestimation of the amount of time that things would take. Do you feel like that was true?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, communication is key. So when you take a course in school, you have a syllabus, you know what you're working with, you know all of those things. And so maybe if it had been outlined for us that, the training was going to require X number of hours, we're going to meet so many times, and then the process would be that we would meet once a month and blah, 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 blah. I think that this whole piece just kind of was evolving. I think that you all were learning and we were participating. So I didn't feel deceived, and I didn't feel I didn't feel like it was too much of a commitment at the time. When I had to step back, it was clear that there were some things going on in my life, but we were well into the process then. But I think maybe after going through this process, I think you could see better how the process would roll. And I think it would be helpful if you kind of put it down on paper for your own guidelines on where you're going with it and what kind of time commitment there is to it. And then people can make that decision. For the most part, I think people were just on board.
Oh, I think people were definitely on board.
It was,
I appreciate
yeah.
that. I mean, it was certainly a learning process for us. I just wanted to make sure that you didn't feel like...
No.
Okay.
I enjoyed every aspect of it. Learning is fun. Learning is fun. Sharing is great. So I think, but if you define it in the beginning, and people who don't have a lot of time, fortunately we didn't run into that, could see right away that they couldn't commit that kind of time to it. And I think that's the only other thing, so out of this interview, that's what I would say, that you could define the time, the involvement a little more clearly now that you know. I don't think you knew before. We were all learning together. And that's what made this so special for me, that we were all learning together and it wasn't so imposing. So when you do write it down, you got to make sure that it doesn't feel like it's very imposing to that person, that they get to have the fun that we had with the whole experience. It was very helpful for, what was her name, Mary
Ellen.
Yeah, Mary Ellen and Mia. That was an invaluable piece to help us with learning the
IRB?
Yeah, the IRB process. I think that's a critical piece. And I appreciated the whole process. I learned from it. I learned a different form of questioning, definitely, and how to ask it. That was a challenge for me, to learn how to ask different questions in different ways to, you know, really get at that answer. That was new for me, and I really appreciated the opportunity to learn a little bit of that. I don't know that I did as well as I could have done, but had we had these kind of sessions so I could see who I was in the process, then I might have been able to put a little more grit into it, because I would have seen where my shortcomings were, and I could have worked to overcome those to bring more quality questioning.
Please don't misunderstand me, because I thought your interviews were wonderful, and I always enjoyed watching them. I think that you have incredible skill. So please, like when we're talking about like making like depressed people on like the harder issues, like I always enjoy watching your interviews, going back and watching them. Like you just have this like knack at putting people at ease and getting them to open up.
Yeah.
So although I think that there are times when I was like, oh, she could have asked this, like,
yeah,
90% of the time I was like, oh, yes.
And you know, I think you have to have a curious nature. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the pieces, and I was curious about someone's story and how people got from point A to point B, and maybe that was why I asked certain questions. It certainly wasn't about skill. I was curious. How did that come about for you? So, you know, you might kind of really stress that in your training part. Just be curious. Be curious. Ask, you know, really be curious about how people got to where they got to be. Because it's an interesting story. I love stories. And I love hearing people share their story, and I'm always curious. So fortunately, maybe I'm glad that you enjoyed my interviews, so maybe that was my redeeming quality that pulls it off for me. I was curious.
I think that's good advice. We're going to shift gears a little bit. How do you define social justice?
Boy, I don't know. I don't know what that definition is. I don't want to give the wrong definition, but I think social justice would be to help people open their eyes to their environment and the conditions around them so that you could help create a level playing field. I think that's what social justice, you can't fight the fight for somebody, but if you can open their eyes and help them to become aware and to be a resource for them and to help them see with clarity, to make a level playing field. I think social justice is a process that helps to bring about a level playing field for people. If that's at all possible in this world.
Did your definition of social justice change because of the project?
Yeah. I kind of felt social justice was more of an activist group. You know, the rah-rah piece. And I learned that it's more of the educational piece that helps to bring enlightenment to people so they can have their own aha moments.
I think it depends on where you're at. But I know that that's a really good explanation of the Social Justice Institute here.
Uh-huh.
But I don't know that that's necessarily true across the board.
Okay.
I think that's a really good summation, though. So can you explain what you learned about social justice through the project?
More than what I just said? See, there you go. Let me ask it in a different way.
So what was your process? How did your definition change? What was it about the project that shifted you from thinking about it as an activist thing to a more of an educational piece?
Well, I don't know what it was called, the forum that was held. I think you all held 2 of them.
At the library?
Here on campus. And
the think tanks?
yeah, the think tanks. And also, I don't know what that program was, but I remember one of the persons that really, really opened my eyes was Professor Flores, I guess his name is.
John Flores?
Mm-hmm. And each person on that dais gave a different talk, but his talk was about how Latin Americans, Mexican Americans, had experienced such injustices, and how they had been brought in the country at different times and then sent out of the country, and et cetera, et cetera. That was most enlightening for me, and the whole form, honestly, I can't tell you, because that was like, whoa, it just kind of really opened me up. And it opened me up in a way because I've lived in California. At one point, I lived in California probably half of my life. And I have a first cousin who is married to a Mexican American who is like my sister. So for the first time, I understood her plight in life, living in LA, and what kinds of injustices she encountered, because I only saw things through the African American lens, and to be able to see it through the Mexican lens was really an invaluable experience for me. And I will just say that all of the think tanks and the forums and the race, food, and equality forums that you've collaborated on, all of those things have provided a lot of enlightenment that about things that I had no knowledge. And you know, when you bring people enlightenment, they can certainly think, behave, and respond into society in different ways than they could being uninformed. And so I feel like the Social Justice Institute has really enlightened myself, as well as many other people in the community. It's kudos to the jobs that you're doing here. I really appreciate it. And personally, I feel, and this is just based on my own personal upbringing, I feel that in some ways that's far more valuable than being out on the street corner doing the rally piece. Although I know that there's a place for both of them and they can fit like a glove, but if you don't get people's attention and you don't educate them, then when you're out on the corner doing the rallying, they really can't hear you. They don't even know. All they just see is somebody, noise, and a disturbance. So I have great appreciation for how the Social Justice Institute has provided the educational enlightenment here. So I've learned from it, from the Social Justice Institute. I've been reshaped because of it, and I know that there's a march on Washington, and I know that there's different demonstrations that happen. But if they're not educated to why these things are happening, then I don't think they can be as effective as we would want them to be. So I endorse the process that I've been able to encounter. So I think that is the social justice that I would promote, to bring education and enlightenment. Then somebody else brings up the rear for the rally and the stand-ups. So now it makes sense, why that's happening. But communication is key. Communication is key. We have Wahoo, Chief Wahoo for the Indians, and my background is working at the African American Museum, so I had to make sure that it wasn't a total activist camp there, and we provided enlightenment for people. But one of the most amazing conversations that I've ever had was with a Native American lady who didn't necessarily see the ills of Chief Wahoo, because she said, finally people get to see us. She felt that it wasn't, she didn't feel that it was as derogatory, and if people didn't talk about that, then they would not have had the illumination that they experienced. So while some people were just outraged by it, there were some Native Americans that felt that it was okay. So there's always more than one way to look at things.
Mm-hmm. So do you think this kind of project is important or useful for social justice work?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you explain how?
I think the way we penetrated the community, people were aware that we were coming into the community. They were apprised of what we were coming in for, and they participated in the sharing of information about their community. So it wasn't someone just giving their views about their community. They had an opportunity to share their voice in how people thought about their community. So when you engage people and not just talk at them and talk down to them, I think it's going to be always far more effective if you give them an opportunity to give input to the process and give input, to the information being shared. It definitely, the buy-in goes a long way. So I think that this whole experience stirred the awareness of people, and it loosened them from their seats of, just being, I forgot the word I was going to use, but it helped to stir their consciousness. It helped to get them thinking, and it helped them to become engaged again if they had just given up hope. People are looking, people are talking, people care what I have to say, that kind of thing. So I think the buzz in the community was really good. It helped to stir it up a little bit, I think it was an excellent project. So with that in mind, the next time you go into a community, you might think about those things that come out of it, and you might shape the marketing piece a little differently, going in and exiting.
So I appreciate your analysis of how our project specifically impacted East Cleveland, but in general, how do you feel about like interviews and oral life narratives and that relationship to social justice work in general?
Invaluable. It's invaluable. Because if you want the history to be, if you want to make sure that the history is as pure as it can be, when people read it from years, you have to be involved in sharing it. You know, history is always just from somebody's perspective. I mean, when you read a history book, it's because somebody put down their views and opinions. So, I always say, if you want to know about African Americans, you have to ask one. If you want to know about a community, you have to ask somebody who lived there. And then you can be sure that you had a voice. The people who are there can be sure they've had a voice in defining what that history of that community was, and the people who are the community researchers can be sure that, you know, they're getting on the ground information and they're not just assuming certain things and taking things at face value. And I mean, it's imperative. I can't see that it could be done any other way. So it's an invaluable experience across the board.
Thanks. Do you feel more empowered, and if so, how?
Well, I feel more empowered because I've had an opportunity to learn a different approach. You know, I have done several oral history projects and continue to do them because that's who I came to this project as, so an oral historian. So I want to continue to do more, and I think that this experience has helped me this experience, including today, has helped me to really think through and learn learn different techniques. And that, you know, you always want to grow. So overall, it has helped me to grow.
And have you been interviewed before? Has someone interviewed you?
No.
How are you finding the experience?
I'm just talking. You're great. You're allowing me to share. And that's the difference between journalism and oral history. You know, they're kissing cousins, but oral history just kind of guides the process, and journalism fires one question after another. I've read something to that effect, and I've also experienced it as such.
I was just wondering, because we have community researchers that have been interviewed and those that haven't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they have different perspectives for having been on the other side of the camera.
I think if you just look at it on either side of the camera, if you just look at it as a conversation, mm-hmm. then you're okay.
I think that's a good way to think about it. So what impact do you think the project has had on participants and the community?
It has heightened their awareness about their community, helped them to see that there is change happening, helped them to review, have their own life review in the context of the city. I think it reinvigorated them to be active in the community. That could be in a number of ways, but they may have become, some of them might have, you get caught up in your day-to-day lives, and you're just so busy doing, you don't think of the greater community. But I think this has helped them to refocus that there are things happening around in the greater community, and even if they're not going to actively be part of supporting that change one way or the other, at least they're thinking about it.
How do you feel it's impacted the community researchers as a group?
I think we've all learned. I think we've learned to work together as a team, and I think the process has been invaluable because it has allowed us to really look at people and the community in a different way. It has stimulated our thoughts about things as well as it has stimulated the thoughts of the interviewees.
And did you have a chance to go to any of the library events that we had, the community dialogues?
I went to I think I went to the first one when you had the panel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I think one of the people that I interviewed was part of that panel too. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it was very nice. I'm hopeful. This is what I envisioned, that this information could be used to help the powers that be, the mayor and city council. I think that they should have an opportunity to have a forum of some sort, workshop of some sort, to really listen to excerpts of these interviews so they could hear what the people think, the people that they represent. I would like to see that happen. I don't know that that has happened, but I think that what these people say should be used to help guide the policymakers' decisions on certain things. And the only way that can happen is if, you have some type of policy maker or think tank for those people. And that was one of the things that I had hoped that would come out of the Snickerfritz oral history collection, that they would review. We didn't get that far, but they would review it, and they would see what people were reminiscing about. And as they would see what people were passionate about, that would help to inform them in terms of where to go for future development. And
that's an excellent idea. We haven't actually talked about that. We've talked about kind of curriculum and like community engagement, but we haven't really addressed like the political leadership. So I think that I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I mean, there's just no way that piece could be omitted, because would maybe help to galvanize their the leadership in some kind of way, hopefully, and bring them on the same page. And this piece could play a role in bringing people on the same page and help them to remember why they're holding the offices they're holding.
Excellent. So this is the last question. How would you change or improve upon the project?
That.
Okay.
Using it for curriculum is one thing, but using it for the policymakers that are currently in office who really are at the forefront of making changes and decisions on behalf of the population. I mean, I think that's where it really needs, that should be the first step. And then the curriculum is the long way around.
So thinking about the questions that we asked, kind of like the history, like your memories of East Cleveland, and then kind of the questions about social injustice, and then the questions about vision for the future.
Mm-hmm.
Which set of those questions do you think would be most helpful for policymakers?
Well, the things that they remember would be very helpful, because that would tell them what has worked. Vision for the future is very important, because that gives them a sense of what people are looking at. And are hoping for. So those two really are hand in hand in terms of helping. And I think that the Social Justice Institute could play a very pivotal role in terms of shaping the city with regard to this kind of a project. And I think that going forward, this kind of instrument could be very instrumental for any city government to see exactly where the thinking is and the dreams and the hopes of the people are, because that's why they're in office, to help that come into fruition. And they don't always get a chance to do that. They get in office and they're in their own heads, and they get into business roles and they think, da 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 da. But we have to be strategic about it. And if you're serving people, you have to hear what the people really want. And I think this kind of a forum would be very, it could be a full day strategic planning session built around this. So then when you leave that session, you definitely would have some bullet points that the policymakers would have to really think about as they move forward, and the things that they instrument, the things that they are striving to bring into fruition. In terms of the city of Cleveland, I had some real definite ideas on how it should be developed. And I'll just say that I felt that it should become a green city. And the Cleveland Foundation offered a workshop that Mark Chupp invited Shai and I to attend. And this was with an artist by the name of Lily Ye. And different communities were represented at this Cleveland Foundation workshop, all day seminar, whatever you call it. And different groups had to cluster together and come up with an idea that would help galvanize their community in an artistic way. So we thought about it, and we came up with the fact that we should have lighting, because GE was the lighting company in East Cleveland, and we could put street lamps up Euclid to Forest Hill Boulevard and up Forest Hill Boulevard to connect to Cleveland Heights, because those were our communities that were involved in our our group. Groups. There were different group clusters, and so that was our group. So not only would you put the street lighting in that could benefit the people, but you would have them solar powered lighting. And then from there, you would engage the school children to see, and in some ways, you could hang baskets of flowers, so that's environmentally correct. Solar powered lighting, environmentally correct. Bringing light and safety to the community, bringing awareness, getting people together to talk about this whole process, having a visual for people to see every day of how that is played out in their city. So it's a dinner table discussion. It's a, community block group discussion. It's a city hall discussion. And so once you get people talking about things, you get them to work on the same page. And once you get them to work on the same page on one thing, then you can build out from there and maybe get them to talk about the second thing. So it's not always, you're not always putting out fires. You're taking a more proactive approach to bring people out of their misery, out of their complaints, to just see a brighter opportunity. So I think that the Social Justice Institute could spearhead a project like that for a community to get them to higher ground in their thinking and get them to higher ground in their collective work together, because that would provide them some common ground. And when you have common ground, that helps you to see one another, and then you start to listen to one another, and all kinds of magical things can happen. So that was something I had to back off of, that I couldn't lead all the way through. But I am still passionate about the idea, and I share that idea with you, and hopefully maybe you all will be able to pick up off of that. I was working at the African American Museum, and one of my very, 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 very close confidants and friends and everything was a NASA employee, and he's since passed on. But he was a dynamic personality, and he brought to us solar energy. And I didn't know about solar energy before he brought it. So we had an African solar village, and we had solar panels mounted on the museum. And everything in this little teepee kind of village area was run by that solar energy. So that was my introduction to it. So then when my son came home from college, he was at Ohio State, I brought him to the table of those solar discussions. And so while he was still in college at Ohio State, he started his own company called Solar Impact. Well, Solar Impact didn't last that long. It never totally got off the ground. But what it did for him, and what I see the results of, is that when you go to the corner of Coventry and Mayfield. There is a solar power bus station there. And there's another one up the hill. And then when you go up the street just a little bit further, just past the bridge, and I can't think of the name of the street, gosh, it's escaping me, on Euclid, you'll see a whole solar farm that was just installed. Mm-hmm. Have you seen that? Mm-hmm. So my son was very instrumental in getting that done.
Oh, excellent.
And so when I was in East Cleveland, I brought that idea and I told Mayor Norton, I said, you need to be a green city. And so, my son and I talked about the green buildings, and that would then bring different businesses in, a different kind of level of businesses, et cetera. Well, Brett started that project with the solar farm idea. He got it so far, but they weren't able to fund it because he was really an outsider for the University Circle area. But what happened from that is he got a job and he works for Evergreen. And under the Evergreen umbrella, the solar farm is there. So I'm saying that to say that it all started with a little conversation at the African American Museum years ago. But if you have these forums where you're talking about future concepts and future vision, and you bring everybody on board, and there should be a whole education piece that goes around that solar farm. People shouldn't just drive past it and just see it over there and not understand it, but it needs to tie in, as you say, school curriculum. It needs to tie into the neighborhood, block conversations. There's a whole education in it. It could bring enlightenment to a lot of people. Now, they're not hearing all of that from me, but I'm sharing that with you. I give that to you as an example of how I see things and how it has manifested within my family to an extent. Now, I'd like to see it go the whole yard, but they shut me down. They won't hear it. They won't hear it. They won't hear it all. But I did have a conversation with Chris Ronayne about it, and he, graciously indulged me. And he and my son have gotten to be good friends as a result of, the evergreen work in the community. But they're not hearing the whole thing. So Yeah. So I give that to you. I think the social justice in the fact that you are bringing enlightenment to people, if you take it another step, I think you could be really, really a game changer in a community. And I think that it all begins with the interview process, because if you don't hear the people and you don't engage the people, then you can't certainly expect to have the kind of outcome that would be a win-win situation for everybody. Done?
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that's quite enough.